So thank you so much for having me. And I love to talk about apples. This is a subject that is, for me, has shown me how everyday things can be windows into the larger world. For me, it was apples, but for you, it may be something else. I grew up eating apples. Growing up in Connecticut, we'd go pick fruit in Glastonbury and we'd go home and make apple crisp. And um, it was a pretty conventional introduction, but a very nice introduction to apples. And then at some point, I started to learn more about them, and I kind of fell into a rabbit hole that I'm still in, and I'm enjoying every minute of it. And so I'm going to share with you my a little slideshow that I put together. So let me just do this, and then I'm going to slideshow this. Okay, so it's loading. Okay, here we go. So I wanted to just be able to show you some of the visuals of the story of apples are very cool. My introduction to apples was very conventional, but at some point I grew up and I got married right here. This was a wonderful restaurant in Agunquit, Maine called Arrows, which is sadly no longer. But my husband and I got married under these trees, and because of that, we kind of turned the wedding into something of a harvest festival. And this is before the book. We had caramel apples as party favors. The colors were all based on the colors of an apple. It was a thing. And a few months after that, a friend of mine who's a literary agent said, have you ever thought about doing an apple cookbook? And it all just kind of came together. And the more I started learning about the history and the number of varieties of apples, the more fascinated I became. And just to start with, you may be more interested in apples than you even realize, because if you go to a supermarket, you buy things like apricots, nectarines, raspberries, blueberries, strawberries. And then when you get to the apple aisle, you are buying Granny Smith, Gala, Fuji, Red Delicious, McIntosh, Golden Delicious. We are aware of apples as being a varietal fruit in a way that we are not aware of other. Maybe we at the supermarket you can buy Meyer lemons and regular lemons, but in fact, all fruit is varietal. But we seem to have only lavished that varietal attention on apples. And so even in a pretty basic supermarket, you have a variety. And when you think of the range of flavors between a Golden Delicious, which is sweet and a little kind of perfumey and not particularly complex, and then like a sharp Granny Smith, you're already getting a sense of how diverse this species is. Just by going to farms and farm stands around New England, I was already becoming aware of the incredible diversity of apples, but it got even deeper the deeper I dug. So let me tell you that there are about 7,500 varieties of apples grown in the United States. There are about 100 grown in any commercial volume, your Honeycrisps, your Pink Ladies, all of those. But apples are grown in 35 states in the country. And this apple that I'm showing you right here was bred at the University of Florida. So now this apple will only grow in northern Florida. It will not grow in Miami, but in the parts of Florida where you still can have, a little bit of chilly weather in the winter, you can grow apples. So there's an enormous band around the world of temperate zones in which apples can thrive. So there's your tropic sweet. I have never had it. I'll have to go to northern Florida to try it out. But the history of apples is where I where this really came alive for me. So my understanding of apples were that they went back very far in American history, that they were very American. And when I pictured the first European settlers coming to the US, I pictured something like this, that there would be sort of a coastal landscape and the pilgrims, washed ashore, exhausted, craving vitamin C, and they were met with these beautiful apple trees, which they adopted and began growing, and la, 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 here we have American as apple pie. But in fact, sweet apples that we eat today come from Asia, not New England. Specifically, if you can see it, there's sort of this border region with a purple line going through it between Kazakhstan and China. There are mountain ranges there, and that is the birthplace of the sweet apples we eat today. There are native crab apples that have grown all over the world. The Malus genus has about 30 to 50 species of apple, but most of them are small and tart and not big and sweet. So the sweet apples that we love come from this area, the border of China, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. And these are the Tian Shan Mountains. So this is kind of a distant look at the Tian Shan Mountains. So we're looking at something much more like the kind of the Rocky Mountains. And if you picture the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, those have for millennia been inhabited by wild fruit trees. So here's a view of these wild fruit forests growing at the base of the Tian Shan Mountains, bordering China. And you can see this is taken in spring. So these fruit trees are blossoming. It's not just apples, it's pears, it's apricots, peaches. There are a lot of different types of fruits that grew in these forests. And I just want to show you a few other, because I just think it's so remarkably beautiful. Here's another view of the fruit forests. I mean, imagine wandering into the forests like the Berkshires, and instead of maple trees and, you know, beech trees and oak trees, you're just finding apple trees and pear trees, and there's fruit dropping all around you on the ground like this. And that's what it really is like. In fact, there's a market, there was a cafe in my neighborhood, and one of the owners was from Kazakhstan, and she had vivid memories of going up into the forest with her family to pick flowers and pick apples in the fall. Here's some other views of once you get some of the trees grow very, very tall. We think that these sweet apples evolved about 4.5 million years ago. And the name of this particular species is Malus sieversii, Siversii. And so these are the earlier, this is the early version of the Malus domestica, which is the sweet apple that we grow now. Just a couple more. I mean, and there's incredible variety. They can be these giant yellow orbs. They can be tiny purple fruits. And people gather them and cook with them, and it's a major part of the culture there. At the base of these foothills is Almaty, which is the capital of Kazakhstan. It means place of apples. But it is absolutely steeped into the culture of this area, that apples originated there. Unfortunately, these foothills there's been a lot of encroachment and development because it's a very beautiful area. So there are efforts to preserve all the genetic diversity. The apples in this area tend to be incredibly disease resistant. So apple growers over here want access to maybe some of the genomes of these apples. Maybe like they can breed a super apple that'll be resistant to all the pests and diseases that apples suffer from. And so Cornell has been working with researchers in Kazakhstan to collect samples of these apples and bring them here. And there's a massive orchard in Geneva, New York, where they are growing the Kazakh apples. So I hope to go there one day, but that is where apples came from. Now, meanwhile, how did they get here? How did they get to America? I mean, that's really far away. So it just turns out that the trade routes that are kind of commonly known as the Silk Roads did pass through these foothills. And so imagine being a traveler in an era where maybe you were a trader and not traitor, and you're hungry and you pass through and you're suddenly finding these delicious sweet things in an era before sugar. And these fruits actually kind of hold up pretty well. You can put them in your pocket and keep walking, and they're not going to rot right away like a raspberry. And you can kind of imagine how easily apples were adopted and actually brought along these spice roots and passed along. And so you begin to see references to apples in ancient texts. The Hittites in the land that is now Turkey, you see references to apples in the year 2000 BC. In 500 BC, you start to see references to apples in Persian cooking documents and in art. And then the Greeks, by 300 BC, the Greeks are recording their practices of grafting apples, which is to replicate or propagate a variety by taking a small cutting from a tree and putting it on another tree. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then they moved up through the Roman Empire. So all along the way, what this map shows, don't worry too much about the scientific notations, but basically what you can see here is that there's a little green area between China and that is the origin of the Malus seversi, the original apples. And as the apples are being brought west through Persia and Greece and Rome, they are actually kind of hybridizing with some of the native crab apples. And so they're taking on new genetic traits and they're evolving. And what this map or what this diagram shows you is that as the apples are moving west, they're growing, they're getting bigger, they're getting sweeter. And then by the time you get to England, you have the recognizable sweet apples of today. Here is a native European crab apple called Malus sylvestris. This is the apples we have today are mostly a mix of the Seversi from Asia and the Sylvestris from China. These started mixing and matching with each other, and if you were to do a genetic analysis of apples, the genes would mostly come from these two older varieties. So then we have the Roman Empire. Now the apples are growing all over what is today Europe, and they are really thriving, particularly in France and England. And of course, it's from England that sweet apples came to the United States, to North America. So so now you've got apples appearing in all kinds of literature and myths. You've got culinary apples appearing in Greek myths, in Norse myths, Icelandic myths, often as symbols of beauty, often as symbols of fertility. But then, of course, we know the most famous apple story in our culture is that of Adam and Eve. It's a funny thing that apples are kind of tagged as being the original fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, because if you think about just in terms of the geography of where we would put the Garden of Eden on the planet, that is not a culture. It's not a climate where apples would thrive. But the original Hebrew word in the Bible for this tree was really more a generic word for fruit, and it was in the northern climates where monks were transcribing the Bible where the word apple was kind of substituted. And it was this painting in the around 1480 from Hugo van der Goes that kind of cemented the image of the apple as the tree of the tree that tempted Eve. But it's not, biblical scholars would differ. They would argue that it most likely was not an apple, maybe a pomegranate, if you were going to try to think of a fruit that actually would thrive in that climate. Depends on how literally, if you see the story as more metaphorical or literal, but that is the classic apple myth. So as the apple is spreading through Europe, we have these varieties that still are grown today. So these are two apples that are in my book that I love that you can still get today. The Calville Blanc du Ver is a French apple. It is a beautiful, very citric, really hearty apple. That is the classic apple you would use in a tarte tatin, which is a classic French apple tart. And that dates back to the 1600s for sure. I mean, a lot of this, nobody, there weren't historians necessarily writing down, today I discovered this apple, but our best guess is 1600s. And again, I have picked this apple at orchards in Massachusetts. And Ashmead's Kernel, a British apple from the 1700s, that is fantastic. It almost has like a champagne quality, like an effervescence to the juice. Also one you can find if you go to an orchard that specializes in antiques, and there are more and more of them now. That's another one worth seeking out. In the US, the apple started coming over with settlers. And the first apple we know of in the United States was planted by William Blaxton. He was the first, I'm sorry, I wrote this up today and I missed an E in European, my apologies. He was the first European settler in Boston. He had a farm on what is now Beacon Hill. And you can actually find a plaque that marks the location of his farm. And he had a tree or an apple variety that he called the Blaxton's Yellow Sweeting. Unfortunately, that apple has not survived, but we just have reference of it in documents. But one apple that does survive to today that I wanted to show you, it is the oldest American apple still in existence, and it is the Roxbury Russet. And I have one right here. actually, sorry, no, that's not a rock. This is a Roxbury russet. So it's by russet, I'm referring to the russeting, which is this brown skin here that surrounds the apple. I love russeted apples because while they are not pretty, the brown skin that they have gives the apple a wonderful nutty flavor. This apple dates back to about 1630. It is delicious. It has lemon and vanilla flavors that to me remind me of a lemon custard. My flavor association with Roxbury russet is lemon custard. And it is very good in pie. It's very good to eat fresh. It's very firm. It will hold up really well. And this is one that you find at more and more orchards. So definitely ask for it because it is really fun to have a bit of history. And it's named after Roxbury. There is a hill in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston where all records seem to indicate that the original farm was located. And I've been to see it, and there are some very old apple trees. I'm sure they don't date back to 1630, but there's evidence of this having been orchard land. And it makes sense because it's on a hill and tree fruit grows really well on hills where it can get more direct sunlight. Okay, so apples in America. Apples played a very important role in early American history. We use them for many things. We use them for a sweet treat. We use them for cider, which would then quickly turn into hard cider in the era before refrigeration. You could then concentrate that cider by freezing it. So on a winter's night, or let's say it's October, you've harvested your apples, you press the juice as this illustration shows, and then you've got this fruit that's starting to ferment. If that freezes, the water will then kind of freeze out of that alcoholic beverage. It will just, the natural process of freezing will kind of extract some of the water. Then you take that more concentrated apple cider, and if you keep repeating that process, you'll end up with something that they call cider, that we would call cider jack. It's sort of a more concentrated alcoholic beverage, and you could use that as an antiseptic, as an anesthetic in the days before anesthesia. And then, of course, you'd use your cider vinegar to preserve the harvest. So there were so many roles that apples played. And in addition, apple cider, the fermented beverage, was in many places more safe to drink than water. So John Adams drank apple cider for breakfast every morning. Children often drank this hard cider. And again, I'm saying it's hard because you really, if you've left a jug of apple cider out, it starts to ferment pretty quickly. So it was a really key ingredient in early American life. So here's an image of a bunch of apple varieties. And I wanted to show this to you because as I've said, there were no sweet apples growing in America when the first Europeans arrived in the early 1600s. By the year 1900, the USDA did a count of all the apple varieties that were known to exist in the United States. They went through that list and they weeded out apples that might be the same apple but have the two or three different names. They came up with a count of 14,000 apple varieties, which is extraordinary. We went from 0 to 14,000 in 300 years. So, and this was what we call the golden age of apples in the 1800s, when apples were just proliferating everywhere. And that's where we got some of the varieties like Northern Spy, Westfield Seek No Further, Baldwin. Some of the ones you may still see around today came from this period. How did we get there? Well, Johnny Appleseed had a huge hand in this. He was a real person. He really looked like this. And he was a member of a Protestant sect called Swedenborgianism. And he really believed that nature, the entire world, was basically a manifestation of God's consciousness. And so he went around trying to tread as lightly as possible on the earth. He went barefoot in the winter so that he wouldn't risk stepping and killing something with his insensitive attired feet. But he was also, so he was a very religious man. He preached the gospel. He really lived his faith. He was also an extremely savvy businessman, because at this period in American history, the Northwest territories of Ohio and Indiana and Pennsylvania, they were being settled. This is after the American Revolution. And the government's position was that in order to take title to this land that we were expanding into, you had to plant an orchard. So this is an illustration of your sort of prototypical Ohio, looks like a pretty prosperous orchard. But you needed to plant 50 apple or pear trees. Why? Because apple and pear trees take about 7 years from planting a little tiny seedling to actually producing fruit. So it was a way for the government to ensure that people weren't going to sort of flip land and, you know, accumulate. It was, you had to put down roots to grow an orchard. And so Johnny Appleseed went out ahead of these waves of settlers, and he planted apples from seed. So he would create these little primitive nurseries. He'd put a fence around them to protect them from animals. And then he would move along his way. A lot of times he'd leave someone local to sort of mind the orchard or mind the nursery, really. He rarely collected the money from any of his endeavors. He really wasn't interested in money, but he did make this fruit available to people. And so he had a huge hand in planting all of these apples that became the varieties we are still, many of them, eating today. So here's where we get into a little bit of apple biology. And I want to just explain this because I actually think you'll be much more interested in this than you think. Johnny Appleseed and other people like him can be credited with getting us to that number of 14,000 varieties, because apples, like humans, are heterozygotes. And what does that mean? It means apples are the expression of genes, a unique expression of genes from the mother and the father. In this case, the mother would be the apple blossom with the ovaries, and the father, quote unquote, would be the pollen that the bee brings to the flowers of the tree. So you have every single apple seed is a unique genetic combination of genes from the flower, which is the mother, and the pollen, which is the father. So every single apple seed in every apple, I have a bag of apples here. Every single seed in these apples is a totally new variety we haven't yet discovered. So as Johnny Appleseed was going around planting, and every apple has about 5 seeds typically, as he was planting seeds from these apples, he was planting entirely new varieties. Now, some of them tasted horrible. Some of them, most apple genes, and apples are actually very genetically complex. They're more complex than we are. Most of the genes code for things like frost resistance, disease resistance, hardiness. They are not coded for sweetness and juiciness and all the things that are important to us. They allow apples to be very hardy and to survive in a lot of climates. So he would plant these apples, and maybe a small percentage of the apples he planted would actually end up being the kind of fruit we'd like to eat. But any fruit that he planted could be used for something, as that we learned earlier is very important, which is cider. So cider became essential on the American frontier. If you planted, 50 apple trees on your homestead, and 2 of them were good for making pies and the rest of them were good for making cider, you were still winning in this equation, because you were going to have a stable source of alcohol, you're going to have fresh juice, you're going to have all kinds of good things, cider vinegar, coming from your apple tree. So the apples didn't need to be sweet. It was only later, when the dessert apple industry really took off, that we started, forgetting the old varieties, the bitter ones that were good for cider but not so good for eating. And we began to consolidate the number of apple varieties that we were growing down from that 14,000 to, the 1,000 to 7,000 apples that you could find in any given country today. So now what we have in our apple industry are orchards that look like this, where we are very intentionally growing apple varieties that we choose to give us the flavors that we like. And that is kind of the nature of apples today. So I want to just show you, just to kind of illustrate again how the apple life cycle works. You have the flower here, you've got your ovaries, and then you have the pollen coming from a bee, or sometimes trees are hand pollinated. That forms an embryo, which forms the seeds inside the mature fruit, and then those seeds can be extracted and grown into a new tree. Now, that is one way to create apples. And that is one way that apple breeders will make a new variety. They will take 2 apples that they like, let's say they like Honeycrisp and they like Granny Smith, and they're wondering what will happen if they combine the genes of those two apples. They will hand pollinate Honeycrisp trees with just the Granny Smith pollen, not any other. They'll put little bags around the blossoms so they can't accidentally be pollinated by anybody else. And they will wait for the fruit to set on those blossoms. They will then extract the seeds when the fruit is mature. And this takes altogether 7 years because you need that tree to grow up and start producing fruit. And then they will start tasting the fruit, and they will see which fruits are good and which fruits are bad. And they will discard, they will rip out the apple trees that are producing bad fruit, and they'll keep propagating the fruit that produces the trees that produce good fruit. Now, this is an apple breeder. This is Dr. Susan Brown. She's at Cornell University. She is an apple genius. And she is responsible for a number of apples. One that is new to the market is Ruby Frost. It's a delicious apple from New York that I highly recommend you look. But this photo above her head of all these apples on a table, these are all apples produced by one single cross. So this is a case where she took two apples, she crossed their pollen, she waited for those trees to grow up, and she picked the fruit from them. And look at the diverse colors and shapes. Now that's just two parents contributing to all of that diversity. So remember, each time she crossed the apple, she got a seed that was a unique genetic combination from those parents. And that's how we end up with such diversity of apples. The diversity also includes color. Some apples will have this beautiful red flesh that you can see in the image above. That's a Redfield apple, which you can buy. I get it at Clarkdale Fruit Farms in Deerfield, Massachusetts. It's a really delicious apple. It almost tastes like raspberries. So that is kind of how we get apple varieties. Now, how do we propagate? If every apple seed is different, how do we keep these apple varieties going? How do we keep this Roxbury russet that dates back to 1630 going today? And that is through the process of grafting. Grafting is taking a cutting from a tree that you like, and then cutting a little piece of it and then sort of splicing it onto another tree, a tree that has a good hardy rootstock that resists disease and grows really well. And here's an example of a tree where they've cut off a branch, they've spliced all these little grafts from a desired apple variety onto it, and they've sealed it up with like a paste to prevent infection. And then they let those branches grow and produce fruit. There's a close-up of how grafting happens. You kind of cut a slice so that it opens up the tissue on the inside. You expose that tissue to the tissue of the host tree, and then you get them to fuse and create a beautiful grafted tree. And that is how all apple orchards work today. That is how you have fields and rows of Honeycrisp. Everything has to be grafted on by hand. Otherwise, you're creating a new variety. So it's a lot of labor, and I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of an extra appreciation for your local apple farmer and your apple breeders and what they do to kind of give us this beautiful fruit. You can graft multiple varieties onto a single tree. There was a farm in Phillipston, Massachusetts called Red Apple Farm that had a beautiful tree out front that had more than 50 different varieties growing on it. It was so gorgeous. I mean, in the height of the fall, it was like all the colors on this one tree. Sadly, it got knocked over during a hurricane, and they have not yet created another. That would take years to create another tree of 50 varieties, but sometimes we'll see, a few varieties on a single tree. So all of this history is what made me so excited to write the Apple Lovers Cookbook, and the research for it was such a pleasure. This is the cover to the book. And I just wanted to give you a very quick taste of what's inside the book, and then I would love to open up to questions and conversation. The first thing I wanted to offer you is this cheat sheet, because given all this apple diversity and all this variety, it can be very confusing to know what to do with these apples that you might pick at the farm or buy at the supermarket. Because tender apples like, say, a Macintosh, you may have had this experience of cooking a Macintosh in a pie, and it really cooks down to almost an applesauce. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a wonderful flavor, but you might want something a little firmer that holds up as like a slice, in which case you want a firm apple. So basically I took 70 varieties of apples and I organized them into these 4 categories that you can apply to whatever you're making. So firm tart apples mean that they're more sour than sweet, and the flesh will hold up really well. in a baked dish like a pie or crisp where it's baking for like 45 minutes to an hour. And that includes unusual apples like the Calvillo Blanc d'Hiver, which I was talking about earlier from France, and very common varieties like the Granny Smith, what you can buy at the supermarket. Firm sweet apples are like firm tart apples, but they are more sweet than tart. So you have your Golden Delicious, your Grafting, your Honey Crisp. A lot of the new varieties that we see today, like Honey Crisp, Crimson Crisp, Cosmic Crisp, Pink Lady, all of the basically popular tastes lean strongly in the firm sweet direction. And so a lot of the new apples you're going to see, the Opal, the Jazz, they're all going to be firm sweet apples. And the nice thing about that is they're very all-purpose apples. You can bake with them. You can eat them fresh. I would say my one hesitancy about the new apples is they tend to be more expensive. I mean, Honeycrisp, when you're paying $2.49 a pound for these apples, an apple pie, which needs, 5 to 8 pounds of apples, can get expensive. So my one pro tip for you, if you like to bake with Honeycrisp, but don't want to spend all that money, is to go with the Jonagold, which is on the same list. You can see it in the center column. Jonagold is a fabulous apple. It has many of the same great qualities of a Honeycrisp. It's sweeter, but it has a nice acidity to balance it. It holds up really well in baking, but it is less expensive, and it's fairly widely available. Maybe not at your supermarket, but certainly at farm stands around Connecticut. I have again bought them at Clarkdale Fruit Farms, and most of the orchards I go to do have Jonagold, so highly recommend those. Then for the tender tart apples, you've got McIntosh's, the classic, and Macun are the classic examples. I'm scrolling too much. The classic examples of the tender tart apple. Cortland is another one. Cortland's a little firmer than McIntosh, but it still gets somewhat soft. Empire from New York State is a good one. And then you have your tender sweets, which are like Fuji and Gala. They're the least common variety that in my experience, but the most famous are the Fuji and Gala. And in England, the beloved tender sweet apple is the Cox's Orange Pippin, which is a delicious apple with many layers of flavor, and I highly recommend it. As I'm winding down my presentation portion, I'll just show you, these are a few of apple recipes from the book. This is one of my favorites. It's a pork and apple pie with cheddar sage crust. It is inspired by British pork and apple pies. Sometimes you go into a pub in England and you'll see a pie on the counter. Half of the pie on one side is pork, and the other side of the pie is apple, and it's sort of dessert and dinner in one dish. With that in mind, I created a layered pie. It's sweet and savory at the same time. It's great for brunch, or if you're doing like a holiday open house. It's really delicious. Anyone who eats meat loves it. Another fun dessert. This one takes no time to put together. It's fabulous when you have friends. It's actually not dessert, it can be great breakfast. When you have house guests, is the Apple Dutch Baby Pancake. Really quick to throw together, very impressive presentation, very, very delicious. And some kind of less, some really wonderful healthy dishes like autumn coleslaw with dates, apples, and pecans, and kind of a lemony honey dressing with cilantro. Or if you don't like cilantro, you could use tarragon. If you don't like tarragon, you could use mint, would be really delicious in this. So there's a few recipes for you, recipe ideas. Here's my website and how to find me.